It's a tricky thing. And then there's the wildlife issue, which as a scientist is near and dear to me. It doesn't take much to interfere with animals of any sort crossing where they would naturally cross for migration or just territory or mating or any of those sorts of things. And the Butterfly Center, you have talked to me about it, and also another friend of mine who's an entomologist went there, and the place is magical. The pictures of it looks like somebody has a domed place where butterflies are trapped. There's so many butterflies. It's just insane. And they want to put a wall through the middle of this. And you think, oh, butterflies can fly over it. No, butterflies are not very good at barriers. They just aren't. Monarchs can get up really high, but a lot of the other ones can't. So you went to see this, right, at the center itself?
Yes. I've been to the National Butterfly Center twice. The first time I was interviewing Mariana Trevino-Wright, who is the executive director, and that was a really interesting experience that I'll tell you about, speaking of Border Patrol agents. And then the second time I went camping there, they had a camp out to just to kind of help people understand that it's not dangerous on the border.
Right.
The National Butterfly Center is right on the border. It's right on the Rio Grande River. The whole area is crawling with Border Patrol agents. There's a surveillance tower. There are drones. There are helicopters. There is a blimp. It's crazy. And but the National Butterfly Center is absolutely gorgeous. It is owned by the North American Butterfly Association, so it's private property. Border wall construction is likely to begin there in February. Wait, it is February. No, it's not. It's almost. Yes, it is February.
It is February. Just barely.
Just barely. So the first time I went there to interview Mariana, to your point, first I drove up. There were 2 Border Patrol agents parked in trucks right near the entrance. They flashed their lights at me. I was like, okay, that's weird. And then I kept going. And then once Mariana and I started walking through the grounds, it's a beautiful center with they've worked really hard to introduce native species or to reintroduce native species, take out invasive species. There are butterflies everywhere, flowers, there's rabbits, little bunnies everywhere. It's really beautiful. And we were approached first by one Border Patrol agent who Mariana introduced us, explained who we were. We were on their property. So there is what's called the Constitution-Free Zone. It's within 100 miles of any border of the United States. So even like the Great Lakes are considered the edge of the United States. All the coastal areas, 2/3 of the U.S. population lives within this Constitution-free, what some people call the Constitution-free zone. The reason they call it that is because our Fourth Amendment rights to protect us from unreasonable search and seizure are compromised by the powers given to the Department of Homeland Security after 9/11. So they can set up checkpoints. They can enter private property without the private property owner's permission. They even will go so far as to get on the rooftop of your house to look for saying that they're looking for illegal immigrants. That happens to people in the Rio Grande Valley. They can request your electronic devices, your cell phone, your computer. So the National Butterfly Center, which is a place where they have campouts, Girl Scouts camp there every year, is basically now just crawling with Border Patrol agents. And I saw that when I was there. We were approached by at least 4 Border Patrol agents. One of them had a German Shepherd on a leash. As they approached, Mariana would caution me because I was interviewing her and I was taping the interview on my phone to put away my phone so that it wouldn't be seized by those Border Patrol agents. I made the mistake. I'm so naive. I made the mistake of asking one of the Border Patrol agents if I could take his picture. And he said no. And then after he left, Mariana said, well, you could have done it. You know, there's no law against taking somebody's picture. So that was before the episode where I filmed the other Border Patrol agent, because I had wised up a little bit. Yeah. But it is really frightening how civil liberties are they are compromised by our fear of, first it was fear of terrorism. Yeah. Now it seems to be just fear of anybody who's not white and American.
Right. And I mean, it seems to me in interacting with people on Facebook primarily, but I run into this sometimes other places too. It seems to me that the people who are most fearful of, you know, asylum seekers or Central American immigrants or whatever, they are not the people who live near the border.
Right.
You know, it's somebody from Alabama or Indiana or wherever, and it's like, y'all don't even live in a border state.
Yeah, I actually was taking notes while I was listening to you speak, and that was one of the things I wrote was border state and sanctuary city. Because as somebody that lives in a border state and lives in a sanctuary city, I hear things said about border states and sanctuary cities, and like it just makes my head spin. I'm just like, apparently I live in a gang-ridden, rape-infested, I can't even go outside without my sidearm because my life is threatened in this horror. And all you have to do is look at the stats to see that sanctuary cities are very safe. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so not only is the data available if you are ignorant about it, but you could ask somebody that lives there, like, are you afraid to walk outside your front door? And no, I'm not. And I live in a really diverse community. I don't live in a gated community. I don't live, and there are all kinds of people where I live, and I walk and do my walks around the neighborhood, and I feel perfectly fine and perfectly safe. I'm a member of Next Door, which is like the neighborhood thing, and there are no stories about, caravans of brown people attacking anybody in the streets. And it's like I just don't understand where the stuff comes from. Well, I don't get it.
Like, I mean, it's like in my neighborhood, again, I don't live in a gated community or anything like that. It's a really diverse neighborhood. And the people that have been guilty of the most vandalism in my neighborhood are white kids, often driving pickup trucks with a Confederate flag in the rearview mirror or the rearview window, So these are not immigrants. They're not.
Yeah, and I mean,
they're not. There's not a speck of color in that pickup truck driving down there smashing mailboxes,
It's just so bizarre to me to be sitting in the situation that's being discussed in a national dialogue and hearing so much misinformation. And you're just kind of looking at the television or looking at Facebook and going, what the hell are they talking about? Right. Like, what fantasy is this? And it's like you're saying, they can just simply say it and people absorb it without question. Mm-hmm. And then they repeat it, and it just spreads around, and it's like, this is completely not what's happening in my city. The city is, like you were describing, we try to do something positive, we try to do something good, and then the state legislature jumps all over it, right? So here in Austin, we tried to, we have, I think, currently still the ban on the plastic bags, and we push for reusable bags, and it's just an environmental thing. It's like, this is a nice environmental thing. We'll go for these bags. And the state legislature loses its crap, and it's just like, how can you do that? And it's like, okay, so first of all, even from a business perspective, right? So the grocery store now doesn't have to give us free bags, and if we forget our bags, we have to buy them. So
win-win.
The store is not hurting, right? The store isn't hurting. They've moved from a model of giving away bags for free by the thousands to selling bags when someone forgets their bag, which I just can't imagine. It almost seems like it's just some grinchy anti-Loraxian, legislature that just simply says, no, you're doing something positive for the environment and it must not happen, because there's no real logic to it. And then they have the other thing where it was like, hey, let's do paid sick leave. right?
Yeah.
So we'll do a week of paid sick leave. If you have a company that's larger than, I think it was like 30 people or something like that, you're employing 30 people, you have to do a week of paid sick leave, if someone gets ill, which is, a generally good idea to not go to work if you're sick and make all the others employees sick, because while you may not be able to afford to have the time off, there might be 3 or 4 other people at work that could afford to have that time off, and it's like, so now they're homesick, and now your company has 4 people out because of the one person that you didn't pay for the 1 week. So it's just like, this is completely backward. It's the antithesis of helping anybody, and I don't see people freaking out in Austin over it, but somehow the state legislature is like, we can't wait to get back in session to undo all this evil that you're doing, like making sure sick people don't go to work and infect everyone else, and making sure the environment isn't getting polluted by all this like additional plastic that doesn't need to be generated. And now it's just like, hey, let's do something that's harmful directly to people. Let's let's just go after people just because they're not white.
Yeah.
We'll vilify them. We'll drum up fear around the country. And they'll find some story like I remember the one where it was a woman who had been killed by somebody who was here without documentation, and it was not here in Austin, but in a sanctuary city. They were here in the U.S., and she had been murdered by somebody that was undocumented. Of course, they never tell you that the majority of people who get murdered in this country, percentage-wise, are killed by other citizens, right? So it's not just that there's more citizens. It's like they're literally people who come here that aren't documented kill less people
than
we kill each other. And so if you really cared, if your problem was murder, you would be looking at why so many fewer illegal people that are here legally.
You'd be busting them in.
Yeah, well, or at least examining, okay, so why are they less likely to kill us? And maybe we should be looking at how we can implement some of that with our citizens, find out how we can do that. And so they're actually a model of a better model of violent crime than our own citizenry, and yet we treat them like they're the problem, right? And they'll say, well, they shouldn't be here. And it's like, so is your problem that their documentation isn't okay, or that somebody got murdered? Because if your problem is murder, then the documentation is actually correlating the other way, and you should be saying that person is safer to be here than my next door neighbor, and it's just amazing to me that they have this. It's so clear that they don't care about the murder. They care about the documentation, and the reason they care about the documentation is this person's not white. And they're afraid of that because they've been taught to be afraid of that.
Yeah, and that gets back to reason and another issue that we talk about a lot. They say that they don't want to abort babies, but they're also against any sort of birth control, which makes zero sense.
I forgot to add, like the whole reason I was bringing up the Sanctuary City killing was that the guy who had killed the woman had been expelled previously from multiple non-sanctuary cities. So they had deported him, he came back, they deported him, he came back, and finally he killed somebody in a sanctuary city. And I'm looking at that and I'm like, so how did the non-sanctuary model protect anybody? Right. Like what did that model do that every time he kept coming back and committing crimes, kept coming back committing crimes? What did your model that was not a sanctuary city do that was an improvement that stopped him from actually coming back in and killing somebody? Was it the sanctuary city that killed him, or was it the response from the non-sanctuary cities that just basically was a non-response?
Yeah.
But they're like, oh, deport him. It's like, yeah, and that you did, and he came back and he killed somebody. Thanks.
Yeah.
That helped.
It's all the sanctuary city's fault. And it isn't.
Right.
It goes back to the failures of previous, right?
Well, and of course, the latest thing in the news is that big seizure of fentanyl at the border.
Oh, yeah.
Coming through a border checkpoint.
Right. Port of entry. Yeah.
Yeah. False floor in the bottom of a truck carrying produce. Customs and Border Patrol agents detected it using their technology, and of course, the fact that they know that people trying to smuggle stuff in the trucks. They're not floating them across the Rio Grande and dragging them through the Butterfly Center. And,
or carrying them in a backpack over a ladder of the border. Yeah.
I actually heard a representative talking, like during the shutdown. The first question was, this shutdown is doing harm to your constituents who are Native Americans. because they weren't getting funding and support during the shutdown, right? So he was like, they're hurting during this period. What do your constituents say, the Native Americans who are suffering because of this, the government shutdown and then the government funding and all of this that stopped? And he said that they generally supported, like they understood about the wall and they understood the need for it, and that they were okay with this because they knew that this was really important and it was about national security and whatever. And so the person was like, well, and then so how is it about national security? Like, what is it that you think that you're being protected from? And he starts to describe drugs, and he's like, well, we have to stop drugs from coming through. And so the interviewer said, so when you talk to your constituents, do you tell them that a wall will stop drugs from coming through the border? Mm-hmm. And he goes, well, no, those are coming through like on checkpoints and stuff. And it's all about border security. It's not about a wall. It's about border security.
Yes.
And we need, more funding to do better checks at these crossings. That's like part of it too, and it's not about a wall. It's about border security. And so the interviewer said, so you would support a package that improves border security at things like checkpoints and stuff, even if it didn't have a wall? Well, no, because we got to have a wall. And I'm like, so it is about a wall.
Yeah.
I mean, this is basically what it is. It's about a wall. And when you start to talk about why you need the wall, you start giving reasons that don't even apply to the wall. Mm-hmm. When you're called out on that, you say it's not about the wall, it's about border security. And so when you're asked, would you approve better border security if it didn't include a wall? And you're just like, no. Well, that's a wall. That's all about a wall.
Well, we always talk about, is this the hill you're going to die on? And now we're down to, is this the wall you're going to die on?
I like how they've been calling it wall.
Like,
people aren't even calling it really the wall. Like, people, especially on Twitter, they're referring it to it as wall with a capital W because that's how Trump refers to it.
Yeah.
So it's become like its own personality or something. Wall. Yeah. Wall is going to do that. Wall is going to stop drugs. And
I love the Twitter meme that went around that had Hillary Clinton saying, you should build it out of my emails because nobody can get over those.
Oh, gosh, that's funny. There's all kinds of stuff. Like, you hear all these horrible analogies, right? So they'll say, well, this is... I saw some people talking about, well, maybe we should just have drones then in our prisons instead of walls. And I'm like, okay, so you think the border wall is what, to keep us in? Because that's what a prison wall is about.
Right.
It's about locking people in that don't want to be there. Are you suggesting that that's what our border wall is?
People don't seem to get that walls work both ways.
Exactly.
I mean, there was a wall between East and West Germany
oh, gosh.
for a long time.
Yes.
The speech, what was it, the speech about the wall? Oh, my gosh, that little speech where it was like, at first it was this, we're all in agreement on national security. This was the talk, I guess, that Trump gave when he was talking about the negotiations and how they were going, and we're going to end this shutdown right now for 3 weeks. And so he gave this little, 10-minute speech or whatever. And he starts out and he's like, this is all... we're all in agreement. We all want to see border security, and we're going to work on that. We're going to look at expert opinion on what needs to be done.
Oh, yeah.
And then it was probably 2 minutes in, and he's just like starts going on about the wall, and he's going on about wall, and he says, wall is going to be great. It's going to work really well, just like it does in Israel. And I thought, okay, well, there's bomb number one. Let's drop that bomb, right? Because that's not a good example, right? That'd probably be a bad example, because the first thing I'm thinking of is Jared Kushner in Israel, like, at the fancy feast while the Palestinians are being bombed and shot outside the Israeli wall, right? I mean, we all saw those images, and I'm like, don't use that as your example. And it reminded me of, it's like, you might as well just say Berlin, right? It's going to work just like it did in Berlin.
Yeah.
I mean, some walls you probably just don't want to
reference.
Yeah, and there was something else he said. I just remember laughing, and I was just like, wow, no, you don't want to use that either, right? Like, and it just went downhill from there, and I was just like, wow, this is, it started out on the first 2 minutes were nice, sort of, we have border security issues and we all agree and we can all work on this, and and it's like, it's great, let's stop the drugs, let's stop the and then it all went to Wild World, and I'm like, okay,
ridiculousness completely.
It's just, but it's just amazing, the ability to just say a thing. Like, you just say it, and suddenly it becomes reality for so many people. Just because it's said.
Again. You just say it over and over again, and if you say it enough times with enough vehemence and enough certainty and from enough different platforms and works and supported by enough bots to get your message out. And then that becomes this false narrative that everybody buys into.
There's so much information, though, that is available that people either they don't have, or and I mean, I'm not going to say that I'm not guilty of this, right? Because I think it's one of those things that you don't know you're doing it when you do it, right? So I'm probably guilty of it myself. But there are just so many times when I'm seeing people talking about things, and they really don't have the information. They have a strong opinion, but no real information. I've had people throw information at me that, immediately when I hear it, I just think, that sounds far-fetched. Right? Like, my first reaction is, that doesn't even sound feasible. And you Google it, and it's like, not even close to fact. And so I've gone back to people and said, this is, or watched other people go back to them and say, here's the fact. And it's like flip-flopped of what you just said. So, and my thing is, where did you get the information? Like, do you even know where you heard this? And in one instance, somebody did. It was like a representative that was from their state that was promoting it. And they said, this is where I heard it. And I was just like, okay. I didn't know who the person was, like when they gave the name. But I found out later it was a representative. But I said, well, whoever that is, next time they tell you something, be sure to look it up, because I wouldn't trust this data that comes from them. This is not a good source of information. And that I feel bad, because these are people in positions of power. And at some point, I understand a person saying, well, I have to put some trust in my elected leadership, because they're getting briefings, and they have access to information. So the model is supposed to be that they know more about it than we do. And it's really sad, because I think they do know more about it, but they're not saying it, right? Or they say it in a way that is misleading, and they know it's misleading, right? 4,000 terrorist suspects across the board. And it's like,
nonsense.
you're confusing people who are taking that number, and they're applying it to this southern border issue. And that number doesn't belong there, but you're mixing it up in a way that is making people think that that's what's happening.
Or the 95,000 people who were registered to vote illegally, and 58,000 of them voted illegally in the last election.
There's something I loved about that, right? Which is that we have this overwhelming Republican legislature that was on
was elected by those people.
That was on the crap end of that stick, right? So it comes out, and it's like 95,000 illegal votes and it was like, obviously, and that's another thing. It's like, that's one of those numbers that when you hear it, if you don't stop and say, okay, that sounds completely ridiculous. That cannot be true. If that doesn't happen in your brain, then you shouldn't have opinions on anything. If you can't recognize that kind of a red flag of this isn't even possible. And so, of course, I think now they're dropping people off the list like by the hundreds per day, right? Like they're saying, and people are getting back in touch with them and saying, "What the hell? Of course, I'm a citizen. Like I voted before," and so they're trying to correct it. But what's really funny is that we have Republican representatives who are kind of being confronted by this fake news promotion.
Oops.
Right, at the hands of their Republican president. And now they are being basically told, you're the problem that's causing the illegal voting, and you're the ones that are, and it's like they're being attacked, they're eating their own. And I'm just like, whatever. You put him in, and now you're the one getting the fake news tweets that, he's attacking you in your state and saying you don't have your shit together, basically. Good. Good. It's crap, but it's crap you get to deal with, Cruz.
And so for people that might not be aware of how this came about, it's an example of the kind of incompetence we often deal with at the state level here. Secretary of State produced this list, and it was based on an extract of information from the DMV when people get their driver's licenses. Well, in Texas, we only renew our licenses every 6 years. And so a lot can happen in 6 years, but when you go to get your driver's license in Texas, you have to produce some kind of identification. And since, I think, 2016, you've had to produce the information that would basically validate your U.S. citizenship. Before then, you didn't have to, because we didn't have this real ID thing that they require now. So anyway, people would come in, and some people had ID that indicated they were not U.S. citizens. Well, they've become U.S. citizens since then. And so if you look at the DMV records, it's going to show that they produced an ID that said maybe it was a green card or a passport or something like that said they were not citizens. So that's where this 95,000 name list came from. And oh my God, 58,000 of them voted in the last election. You know, and it turns out that I think they've yet to find a single person who voted, a single instance of a non-citizen voting from that list.
There are literally people that are involved in this mess right now that are saying, you know what, we need to just stop.
Yeah.
We need to go back and pull a good list.
Yeah.
Like this list was a bad idea. It's and it's just been it's a train wreck. It's a big hot mess.
But Trump tweeted it. Trump
Yes.
tweeted all those numbers, and all
Yep.
those people who just follow whatever he says are just going to buy it. And I think, in a way, it goes back to our education system and teaching people to think critically and evaluate sources and question authority and think about what they're being told. And I don't think that our education system is succeeding in a lot of ways at teaching people that.
And that's an excellent point. And the other thing is, this is a classic propaganda tactic, because Texas demographics are not in favor of the Republicans.
Right.
Texas is trending blue.
Right.
And I mean, we saw this in the last election when Ted Cruz was crapping himself on election night because Beto was so close. He was not supposed to be that close.
Yeah, that was almost miraculous.
Yeah.
Coming from an atheist, that's saying something.
So now by publicizing this $95,000 or 95,000 illegal voters in Texas, now they're poisoning the well. So when Texas goes blue, they can say, "Oh, it's because of all those illegals that are voting," even though it is not a problem. No one who is a non-U.S. citizen voted in the last election. There's no evidence that that's happening in Texas or really anywhere else. Because if you're not here legally, if you don't have legal immigration status here,
vote.
You can't vote. And why would you even sign up to vote knowing that you would put yourself at risk of deportation?
Yes.
And if you got deported for that, you would never get back in.
Yes.
Not only deportation, but they were talking about that.
Yeah. Put you in prison.
On NPR, they were discussing that there's like super harsh penalties for that type of voting. And they were like, if you get caught, the penalties are really bad. They're really stiff. And in order, to take that risk would just be ridiculous.
Which shows you how wound up their fear level is.
Well, I thought of a really good analogy. I guess it was maybe like a week and a half ago. And I just thought this is because I was trying to think of how to describe it, right? And it really didn't have to do with the political structure, but I guess you could apply it to that, right? So I was thinking more in terms of indoctrination versus critical thought. Like when you put a lot of energy, for example, when I was a Christian, right, I put a lot of energy into learning about the doctrine, going to classes and studying and researching and asking questions. And so later, when people would say like you're not being critical, you're not asking questions, you don't really know about it, I would be like, no, I've really studied this and I've really looked at this. But it was all geared toward learning it, not questioning it.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just like, how do you explain that? And then I started to think about it, and I thought, it's almost like when you become a sales associate at a company, right?
Yeah.
You just want to go and you need to learn the product. You need to learn all the selling points of the product. You also want to have the information about like how it's not as good as maybe your competitor's product, but you're not going to give that to somebody. You're not going to walk up and say, well, our competitor actually offers this really cool feature that we don't. You don't tell people that, right? So you're more focused on, let me know what sells the product, what will sell this product. And so you go in and you learn that because your whole goal is to promote this, not to challenge it. So you're putting in time, energy, you're reading, but you're looking at all the sources that are about how great your product is, and you don't want to hear how it's not great.
Support your point of view.
Now, on the other side of that is the customer. And the customer is far more likely to be looking at your product, to be looking at your competitor's product, to be asking you, well, they offer this feature, but I don't see that. Does your product do this, right? The customer is the one that's critically looking at the product, right? That's looking at those selling features and saying, but I also need to know if you can do this for me, or, what happens when it does that? And does it have a conflict with this? And can it merge with this other program? Can it, and so I think we need to look at ideologies like customers, not like salespeople. because there's too many people that are ready to be the salesperson because they already are on board. It's almost like they've been hired by the company, and now they just want the selling point so they can go out and sell it. And it's like, no, you need to be the customer. When they come to you and they're giving you the information about the product, you don't have to be somebody's sales associate. You can actually be the customer. I just think that we need more customers.
Well, and the main selling point is fear. The main thing they're using to sell all these ideas is fear.
Right, but then they have the propaganda points.
Yeah.
But they're not even true, right? It's like me saying, yeah, my copier can put out 200,000 sheets a month, and that's no problem. And I'm totally lying to you. The thing is stretched at 50,000.
Or saying that copier will give you cancer. You should buy my copier.
Yeah. No, you're right. You're right.
Yeah.
It reminds me of the woman that we talked to at the march, and her synopsis of it being that they're looking for their savior. They don't want to question. They want somebody to help them. And it doesn't matter what they say. Just like in indoctrination, they'll believe it, and they'll...
But it's like Jen is saying, we're talking about, someone in Nebraska who thinks they need to be saved by MS13, from MS13, right?
Right.
And we're sitting there going, we live in a sanctuary city in a border state, and MS13 is like, we don't even think about it.
It doesn't exist here.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't come up in conversation. Nobody worries about it. I wouldn't recognize a gang flashing sign if I saw it.
The degree to which it is not here is I am a street art connoisseur, so to speak, and I photograph it and document it, and I love it, and I hate tagging. I have never, ever in Austin seen an MS13 tag. Never. And I look for it.
Yeah, and I wouldn't know one if I
Tagging
did,
stuff.
which is like a testament to how it's not a concern for
Well,
me.
the thing is, I mean, MS-13's not coming across the southern border because MS-13 was born here.
Yeah, aren't they in prisons and stuff?
Yeah, it's a prison gang. And in fact, we exported it to Central America, not the other way around.
The whole thing is just whack, And like I said, you just sit here in the sanctuary city, in the border state going, the hell are they talking about?
Yeah.
Right?
This is gaslighting at its finest. It's gaslighting.
And the border cities are even safer. The border cities,
Right.
the ones right on the border, are some of the safest in the United States.
Yeah.
I remember telling somebody about the statistics around violent crime and immigrants, including immigrants without documentation. And they were just like, well, where are you getting that information? And I was just like, well, here's like this, let me back up the truck of studies that I can dump on you here. And so I just dumped them. I wasn't being like a brat about it. I was just saying, well, there's this one, there's this one, there's like, they looked at the data like this, they looked at the data. And I was like, no matter how you slice and dice this data, the closest thing I've seen to a challenge to it was like a specific location where they found like a flipped
Cherry picking.
a flipped correlation. But it's just like it's not even challengeable. And most of the legitimate criticism around it is that it's very hard to get the data at all. So it's very hard to get good data on people that are not wanting to be identified. And I understand that, but you still have to look at it like, okay, but we're still left with the data we're left with, right? So if you're going to look at the data, you can say like, well, we need better data. And I would agree. I'd be happy if we had like really good data on it. That I'm not worried about getting better data. And if I'm wrong, I want to know I'm wrong.
But
right?
you can't say...
Right. But you still got to use data. And when people are saying like, oh, they're dangerous and they're violent and it's like, yeah, but that's not what the statistics show. Is there going to be somebody in that population that's dangerous and violent? Sure. But does that mean that violence and murder and stuff in this country is being perpetuated on some escalated level by immigrants or people without documentation?
Quite the opposite.
Yeah. And that's what I've said before. If you could wave a magic wand and delete the immigrant population from the U.S., you would literally be concentrating the violent criminals.
Yes.
You would be raising your own risk and your neighbor's risk of being violently assaulted or murdered in the country by eliminating the lesser violent populations.
Awesome. Just wonderful discussion. We have just a little bit of time left, and you had some things that you wanted to say before we go. Is that right? Did you have anything else you wanted to?
I just have one more thing.
Okay,
please.
so let's...
I want to go back to something that Jen
cool.
said about walls keeping people in as well as keeping them out. So probably y'all are aware, I'm not sure everyone's aware, that in the Rio Grande Valley, people are being denied passports. And they're being denied passports on the basis of being delivered by a midwife,
certain providers.
By certain
Right.
providers.
Right.
By certain providers. And that's scary to me. Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, my understanding of how this is determined is they're basically saying that there have been some providers that were identified who have been convicted of literally single-digit falsification of birth certificates.
Yeah.
These people have delivered hundreds and hundreds of children, and yet they've been convicted of a couple of falsifications.
Or even just accused. I mean, there's some,
Yeah, some cases
sometimes
not
not
even
even just
convicted,
convicted.
But
just
what's happening,
accused.
though, is that they're literally now putting freezes on all of the people that were ever delivered by them.
By that person.
And it's just whoa, okay.
And coincidentally, one of the doctors whose the babies that he delivered and that his clinic delivered, they're putting freezes on those babies being allowed to get passports is the father of Mariano Trevino Wright, who runs the National Butterfly Center, who's a very outspoken critic of the Trump administration and of the wall. And they are targeting, he was a doctor, delivered thousands of babies in the Rio Grande Valley. And on the basis of one person's affidavit that they won't even produce, they're saying that those birth certificates are invalid, that they're refusing to provide people passports. The other thing that's happening is that immigration activists who are crossing into Mexico to help asylum seekers in Tijuana, this just was reported in the LA Times, I think yesterday. Their passports are being flagged by Mexican immigration officials, and they're being prevented from entering Mexico or kicked out of Mexico. So in other words, and they're being told that their passports are flagged by an unknown country. So imagine if you try to travel and you're an activist or an attorney or anybody, and you're told sorry, you can't leave or you can't come into our country. Your passport's been flagged by an unknown country. That scares the crap out of me.
Isn't this the nightmare that all the preppers and the NRA advocates were saying? They were so prepared to respond to with this revolution. Where's the revolution?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, or just where is the outrage about this attack on people's civil liberties?
Yeah,
right.
And
the things that you're describing are the same stuff that when Alex Jones was back in Austin, this is the stuff he would have crapped his pants over.
Yeah.
And now he's supporting it.
Yeah, it's really interesting how things change with the direction the wind is blowing.
I did want to say, though, about the birth, just before we get too far off the birth certificates, the one thing that was interesting is there were a lot, when this broke, there were a lot of stories about how they were addressing it with people, right? So people were being surprised, I can't get a passport.
Right.
And so when they would look into it, they were told basically we have to validate your birth, right? That you were born here. Now, I was just if you reject my birth certificate,
Right.
How?
right? What am I supposed to do?
Right.
And one of the questions, and people can Google this because I would be saying that this is one of those red flags where I would say that sounds like bullshit to me, but please go and Google it because I don't blame you for thinking it's bullshit and I encourage you to look it up. One of the questions that we're asking people is, do you remember when you were born?
Yeah.
Right? I mean,
Yeah, I do. I remember it clearly.
Yeah, see, my wife jokes with me about that all the time. She's like, well, you remember your birth. And I'm like, well, no one remembers their birth.
right. I'm glad I don't remember my birth.
Yeah, me too, actually.
It's probably not a time I want to recall.
No, I think that's blacked out for a good reason.